Quran 482. Do they not ponder about the Quran? Had it been from any other than Allah, they would surely have found in it much inconsistency. This is a challenge within the Quran. So if you can find much inconsistency in the Quran, you disprove the Quran is from a god. You disprove Islam. Challenge accepted. How much is a slave worth to Allah? There are several passages in the Quran which describe freeing a slave for different reasons, but they also offer alternatives for those Muslims who don't own slaves to do something of equivalent value by either feeding the poor or by fasting. The problem is they are all different from one another, and so the value of a slave to Allah keeps changing. For example, Quran 492. And whoever kills a believer by mistake, then the freeing of a believing slave and a compensation payment presented to the deceased family is required, unless they give up their rights as charity. But if the deceased was from a people at war with you and he was a believer, then only the freeing of a believing slave. And if he was from a people with whom you have a treaty, then a compensation payment presented to his family and the freeing of a believing slave. And whoever does not find one or cannot afford to buy one, then instead a fast for 2 months consecutively. So the penance for accidentally killing a believer is the freeing of one slave or 2 months of fasting, but no amount of feeding the poor equals the freeing of a slave. However, the freeing of a slave's value changes when divorcing and returning to your wife. Quran 58, 3-4. And those who pronounce tihar from their wives and then wish to go back on what they said, then there must be the freeing of a slave before they touch one another. That is what you admonish thereby, and Allah is acquainted with what you do. And he who does not find a slave, then a fast for 2 months consecutively before they touch one another, and he who is unable, then the feeding of 60 poor persons. Freeing one slave still equals 2 months of fasting, but also feeding 60 poor people, whereas the earlier verse, feeding any amount of poor people, did not equal a slave. The value of a slave changes again if you break an oath. Quran 589. Allah will not impose blame upon you for what is meaningless in your oaths, but he will impose blame on you for breaking what you intended of oaths. So its expiation is the feeding of 10 needy people than the average of which you feed your own families or clothing them, or the freeing of a slave. But whoever cannot find or afford it, then a fast of 3 days is required. Now, freeing a slave is worth only 3 days of fasting to Allah instead of 2 months, and only feeding 10 poor people instead of 60 or none, as in the previous verses. The value of a slave changes again if you want to take the righteous path. Quran 90, 12-16. And what can make you know what is breaking through the difficult pass? It is the freeing of a slave, or feeding on a day of severe hunger an orphan of near relationship or a needy person in misery. Now freeing a slave is only worth the feeding of one person, and no amount of fasting will be enough for Allah to equal the freeing of a slave. And if you kill a slave, the value of a slave changes again. Quran 2:178. O you who have believed, prescribed for you is legal retribution for those murdered, the free for the free, the slave for the slave, and the female for the female. In this case, Allah flips the script and prefers dead slaves to free ones, and no amount of feeding the poor or fasting will satiate his need for blood. So if you don't own a slave to sacrifice for Allah, I guess you need to murder somebody else's. It appears the Quran doesn't know what the value of a slave is to Allah. Sometimes a slave is worth feeding one poor person, or 10, or 60, or none. Sometimes a slave is worth 3 days of fasting, or 2 months of fasting, or none. And sometimes killing a slave makes Allah more happy than freeing one. It appears I found much inconsistency within the Quran. It appears the Quran is debunked.